Hello, and welcome to this episode of An Interview in History. This week's interview takes place in October 1921, and we'll be talking to Elizabeth Jane Cochrane, or Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was an American journalist who was widely known for her record-breaking trip around the world in 72 days. She worked undercover to report on a mental institution from within. She was a pioneer in her field and launched a new kind of investigative journalism. Hi, Miss Cochrane, or Miss Bly. What should I call you by?
I'd prefer to go by Elizabeth, if you wouldn't mind. I know that I'm better known as Nellie Bly, but I like my God-given name for these proceedings.
Absolutely, whatever you prefer, and thank you for the clarification. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and family?
Certainly. I was born in 1864 in Cochrane's Mills, Pennsylvania. My father, Michael Cochrane, started out as a laborer and mill worker before buying the local mill and most of the land surrounding our farmhouse. He later became a merchant, postmaster, and associate justice at Cochrane's Mills, which was named after him. My father married twice. He had 10 children with his first wife, Catherine Murphy, and 5 more children, including myself, and I was his 13th daughter with his second wife, Mary Jane Kennedy. My father died in 1870 when I was 6. I know it's rather silly, but as a young girl I was often called Pink because I so frequently wore that color. As I became a teenager, I wanted to portray myself as more sophisticated, and I dropped the nickname. In 1879, I enrolled at Indiana Normal School for 1 term but was forced to drop out due to the lack of funds.
Elizabeth, when did your passion for writing begin?
I would have to say in 1885. A column in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled "What Girls Are Good For" stated that girls were principally for birthing children and keeping house. This prompted me to write a response under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. The editor, George Madden, was so impressed with my passion and ran an advertisement asking the author to identify herself. When I introduced myself to the editor, he offered me the opportunity to write a piece for the newspaper, again under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. My first article for the Dispatch, titled "The Girl Puzzle," argued that not all women would marry and that what was needed were better jobs for women. My second article, "Mad Marriages," was about how divorce affected women. In it, I argued for reform of divorce laws.
Wow, you really hit the ground running. So then, when did the name Nellie Bly come into being?
My article, "Mad Marriages," was published under the byline of Nellie Bly, rather than Lonely Orphan Girl. It was customary for women who were newspaper writers at that time to use pen names. The editor chose Nellie Bly, after the African-American title character in the popular song "Nellie Bly" by Stephen Foster. I originally intended that her pseudonym be Nelly Bly, but my editor wrote Nellie by mistake, and the error stuck. Madden was impressed again and offered me a full-time job.
So that's how it all began.
Yes.
Tell me more.
So then I focused my early work for the Pittsburgh Dispatch on the lives of working women, writing a series of investigative articles on women factory workers. However, the newspaper soon received complaints from factory owners about my writing, and I was reassigned to women's pages to cover fashion, society, and gardening, the usual role for women journalists. I did not like that at all. Granted, I was only 21, but I was determined to do something no girl has done before. I then traveled to Mexico to serve as a foreign correspondent, spending nearly half a year reporting on the lives and customs of the Mexican people. My dispatches later were published in book form as 6 Months in Mexico. In one report, I protested the imprisonment of a local journalist for criticizing the Mexican government, then a dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz. When Mexican authorities learned of my report, they threatened me with arrest. I fled the country. When I was safely home, I accused Diaz of being a tyrannical czar, suppressing the Mexican people in controlling the press.
That was quite a chance you took. I see that you've done that often. Talk to me about the Women's Lunatic Asylum.
Once again, I was burdened with theater and arts reporting, so I left the Pittsburgh Dispatch and went to New York City. I faced rejection after rejection, as news editors would not consider hiring a woman. Penniless after 4 months, I talked my way into the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, The New York World, and took an undercover assignment for which I agreed to feign insanity to investigate reports of brutality and neglect at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island.
So how did a very sane woman get admitted to the asylum?
It was not easy for me to be admitted to the asylum. I first decided to check myself into a boarding house called Temporary Homes for Females. I stayed up all night to give myself the wide-eyed look of a disturbed woman and began making accusations that the other boarders were insane. I told the assistant matron that there are so many crazy people about, and one can never tell what they will do. I refused to go to bed and eventually scared so many of the other boarders that the police were called to take me to the nearby courthouse. Once examined by a police officer, a judge, and a doctor, I was taken to Bellevue for a few days. Then, after evaluation, I was sent by boat to Maxwell's Island.
Wasn't all this very frightening to you? And you felt you could last?
Could I pass a week in the insane ward at Blackwell's Island? I said I could, and I would, and I did.
But weren't you frightened?
Of course I was. Once I was committed to the asylum, I experienced the deplorable conditions firsthand. I always made a point of telling the doctors I was sane and asking to be released. But the more I endeavored to assure them of my sanity, the more they doubted it. The insane asylum on Blackwell's Island is a human rat trap. It is easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out. Finally, the asylum released me at the world's behest after 10 days. My report, published October 9, 1887, and later in book form as 10 Days in a Madhouse, caused a sensation, prompted the asylum to implement reforms.
Amazing stuff. What was next?
As a result of that piece, I scheduled an exclusive interview with the allegedly insane serial killer Lizzie Halliday.
You have done some amazing things. Now tell me about your trip around the world.
I suggested to my editor that I take a trip around the world, attempting to turn the fictional Around the World in 80 Days into fact for the first time. It was a year later, at 9:40 a.m. on November 14th, 1889, and with 2 days' notice, I boarded the Augusta Victoria, a steamer of the Hamburg America line, and began my 24,898-mile journey. To sustain interest in the story, the paper organized a Nellie Bly guessing match in which readers were asked to estimate my arrival time to the second, with the grand prize consisting at first of a trip to Europe and later on spending money for the trip. During my travels around the world, I went through England, France, where I met Jules Verne, Brindisi, the Suez Canal, Colombo, the Straits settlements of Penang and Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. Just after 72 days after my departure from Hoboken, I was back in New York. I had circumnavigated the globe, traveling alone for almost the entire journey. My journey was a world record.
My goodness, you lead a remarkably exciting life. What about marriage? I know you were married for a while.
Yes, I was. In 1895, I married millionaire manufacturer Robert Seaman. I was 31. He was 73 when we married. Due to my husband's failing health, I left journalism and succeeded my husband as head of the ironclad manufacturing company, which made steel containers such as milk cans and boilers. My husband died in 1904.
So then you went on to maintain the business then?
Yes, and it turned out that I was an inventor in my own right, receiving U.S. patent for a novel milk can and U.S. patent for stacking garbage can, both under my married name of Elizabeth Cochrane Seaman. For a time, I was one of the leading women industrialists in the United States. But my negligence and embezzlement by a factory manager resulted in the ironclad manufacturing company going bankrupt.
That must have been tough.
Yes, however, I got some good out of it as well. You see, I ran my company as a model of social welfare, replete with health benefits and recreational facilities. But sadly, I was hopeless at understanding the financial aspects of my business and ultimately lost everything. Unscrupulous employees bilked the firm of hundreds of thousands of dollars, troubles compounded by protracted and costly bankruptcy litigation.
I'm so sorry to hear about that. What did you do next?
I went back to reporting. I covered the women's suffrage procession of 1913 for the New York Evening Journal. My article's headline was "Suffragists Are Men's Superiors," and in its text, I accurately predicted that it would be 1920 before women in the United States would be given the right to vote. Next, I wrote stories on Europe's Eastern Front during World War I. I was the first woman and one of the first foreigners to visit the war zone between Serbia and Austria. I was arrested when I was mistaken for a British spy.
Were you released shortly after being arrested?
Yes, I was released after being recognized.
How did you feel about being arrested?
It is only after one is in trouble that one realizes how little sympathy and kindness there are in the world.
Well, Elizabeth, Nellie, this has been one of the most fascinating interviews I've had. Thank you so much for joining me here, and I wish you nothing but the best for the future. Come back when you have more adventures.
Thank you. I would love to come back sometime in the future.
Died of pneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital, New York City, age 57. In 1966, a family-run amusement park opened in New York City using the name Nellie Bly because of her reputation as an adventurer. Join us next week as we are talking with Bram Stoker, the author of that classic novel, Dracula. Until then, take care.